There were no parades waiting for them. No warm farewells, no medals, no quiet retirements, just dust, blood, and silence. These men, giants of the American frontier, didn't live soft lives, and they sure didn't get soft deaths. They didn't fade into history with a smile. They went out with a scream, or worser. They fought against nature, against men, and sometimes against themselves. You've heard their names in half-told legends. You've seen them played by Hollywood stars. But forget the myths. Today we uncover the brutal, raw, and unromantic truths about how they really died. The American frontier was never a place of rest. It was a land that promised freedom but demanded everything in return. A place where death didn't always come with fanfare or dignity. Out on the plains, in the Rocky Mountains, or deep in the swamps, the end didn't arrive with warning or mercy. And for the men who carved their names into its blood-soaked soil, the frontier offered no exception, no escape. These men, trappers, scouts, gunmen, outlaws, and explorers, lived on the edge of civilization and sanity. They survived more than most could imagine. But in the end, not one of them walked away unscathed. What makes their stories so deeply tragic and deeply human is how their deaths mirrored the brutality of the lives they led. Some were killed in ambushes, their bodies left for vultures. Others slowly wasted away, forgotten by the very people who once celebrated their grit. Many of them weren't even recognized as heroes until long after the grave had claimed them. It's easy to admire the courage of a man standing tall with a rifle, but less easy to reckon with the reality that courage doesn't always bring reward. The frontier didn't respect bravery. It didn't care about justice. It just took what it wanted and kept moving. The American frontier was a paradox. It was an open expanse full of opportunity, yet filled with invisible traps. Wild animals, disease, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of violent death. These men didn't just face enemies in war paint or uniforms. They faced hunger, frostbite, snakebite, infections that had no names and no cures. And somehow they kept going, they kept fighting. But survival wasn't a badge that protected them forever. If anything, it only prolonged the inevitable. Their bodies became maps of scars and suffering, and even the toughest men eventually ran out of time. Their deaths strip away the Hollywood gloss we often attach to their lives. There were no orchestras swelling in the background, no last-minute redemption arcs, no glory-filled goodbyes. Wild Bill Hickok died with his back turned. Jesse James was assassinated while adjusting a picture on the wall. Hugh Glass, who crawled hundreds of miles after a bear attack, finally met death in an ambush he couldn't crawl away from. Billy the Kid, once feared and hunted across the West, was shot in the dark, unarmed by someone he trusted. These weren't cinematic ends. They were sudden, cold, and unceremonious. The frontier didn't hand out poetic finishes. Even the ones who lived long enough to die in bed didn't do so in peace. Take Jim Bridger. He saw more of the untamed West than nearly any man alive. He led expeditions, survived battles, and gave his life to exploration. But when old age came, it didn't bring celebration. It brought blindness, isolation, the bitter knowledge that the world he helped shape had moved on without him. He died mostly forgotten, a relic of a past that people were already trying to rewrite. And that's what the frontier did best. It used people up, then left them behind. This is the uncomfortable truth that history tends to shy away from. We like our legends wrapped up in neat endings. We like to think the good guys died heroes and the bad guys got what was coming. But the American frontier didn't work that way. Death was random. It was merciless. It had no concern for moral character or narrative justice. The land didn't care if you were a lawman or an outlaw, a soldier or a scout. When your time came, it came hard, and often without warning. And maybe that's why these stories stick with us so deeply. Because they are not just tales of adventure and survival. They are reminders of fragility. No matter how bold or brave these men were, the wilderness always had the final word. Their ends remind us that grit isn't always enough. That sometimes fate doesn't care how many battles you've won, how many rivers you've crossed, or how many scares you carry. Sometimes all it takes is a single bullet, a moment of trust, or a quiet disease to bring a legend down. The myth of the American frontier is one of heroes who rode off into sunsets. But the reality is far more sobering. These men were shaped by hardship, and destroyed by it too. They didn't get closure. They didn't get rest. And yet they kept going until their bodies gave out, their enemies caught up, or their luck finally ran dry. So when we speak of these men, we shouldn't just remember the tales of their triumphs. We should remember how they died. Because in those endings, tragic, violent, often forgotten, is the true price of frontier life. It's where we find the truth the frontier didn't make legends. It broke men. And only the broken ever truly belonged to the West. Wild Bill Hickok was the embodiment of the firm myth. Handsome, fearless, deadly with a gun. He wore his hair long, carried a pair of ivory-handled pistols, and moved through saloons and dusty streets with the quiet swagger of a man who'd seen death and survived it more than once. To many, he was the West. Romantic, dangerous, mysterious. But what makes his story unforgettable isn't just how he lived, but the stark brutality of how he died. He'd lived a life on the edge, walking a thin line between law and lawlessness. He had been a Union spy during the Civil War, a sheriff, a gambler, and a gunfighter. People either feared him or wanted to be him. His reputation preceded him, sometimes earning him trouble in towns he had never even set foot in. He was known for his quick draw and unwavering stare, a man you didn't challenge unless you had a death wish. Yet for all his skill, for all his deadly confrontations survived, the moment of his death came in the most cowardly way possible. On August 2, 1876, in Deadwood, South Dakota, Wild Bill sat down to play poker at Nuttleman's saloon. It was a game he had played 1,000 times in 100 towns with money that came and went like whiskey. But that day, he couldn't sit in his preferred spot, his back to the wall where he could see every entrance, every movement. The seat was taken. Reluctantly, he sat with his back exposed to the door, something he was known to avoid at all costs. It was a quiet moment, the kind that doesn't announce itself before history is made. Jack McCall, a drifter nursing a grudge and perhaps a swollen sense of his own importance, entered the saloon carrying a small revolver. Bill didn't see him. He was focused on his hand. 2 black aces, 2 black eights, the cards that would later be known as the dead man's hand. Before he could react, McCall raised the gun and fired a single shot into the back of Hickok's head. The bullet exited through his cheek and struck another player across the table. Wild Bill died instantly, slumping forward without a sound. There were no drawn pistols, no tense standoff, no chance to defend himself. The man who had survived duels, ambushes, and gunfights across the West met his end at the hands of a coward with a bullet to the back of the head. The irony was as cruel as it was complete. For a man who built his life on readiness, caution, and speed, death came not because he was slow, but because he was betrayed by a moment of vulnerability. Jack McCall fled the saloon but was quickly captured. At his first trial, held under an unofficial miners' court, McCall claimed he was avenging his brother's death. The court let him go. Later, when he drunkenly bragged about killing Hickok in another town, he was retried, this time by a legitimate court, and hanged. But the damage had been done. The man whose name was feared from Kansas to Colorado was gone, silenced in an instant by someone whose only claim to fame was pulling a trigger from behind. What makes Wild Bill's death so significant isn't just the loss of a legendary figure. It's what it says about the world he lived in. The West didn't honor your legacy. It didn't care how fast your draw was or how many men you'd bested. It only cared about the moment, and sometimes that moment turned on you without warning. 1 second, you were a symbol of frontier justice. The next, just another body on a saloon floor, blood soaking into the wood, a hand of cards still clutched in your stiff fingers. The tragedy lies in how sharply his death contrasts with life he lived. He was a man who should have died in a standoff, perhaps, or in some final act of valor. Instead, he died like many of the people he'd once arrested or outdrawn, in a blur of noise and violence, without even time to look his killer in the eye. The man who never turned his back on danger had finally been forced to, and that moment cost him everything. It's easy to get lost in the myth of Wild Bill, the stories of his duels, the tales of his piercing gaze that could freeze a man mid-step. But when we remember him, we shouldn't just remember the legend. We must remember the man. A man who knew that death was always close. A man who lived with his guard up and still, one afternoon in Deadwood, let it drop just long enough for death to creep in behind him. His story is a warning. In the frontier, there were no rules except survival. And even survival wasn't guaranteed, not for the fastest, the smartest, or the most feared. In the West, sometimes you didn't get a chance to draw. Sometimes, all it took was a missed instinct, an unlucky seat, a man with a gun behind you. And that's the brutal reality of how legends fall. Davy Crockett was a name that carried weight even in his own lifetime. He wasn't just a frontiersman. He was a politician, a soldier, and an icon of the expanding American spirit. He symbolized rugged independence, wit, and unbreakable resolve. From his early days in Tennessee to the floor of Congress, and eventually to the walls of the Alamo, Crockett built a reputation on more than just myth. But while the stories about his life soared with legend, the truth of how he died was far less glorious, and far more human. He had grown tired of politics. After speaking out against President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act and losing his seat in Congress, Crockett famously declared, "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." And he meant it. He went looking for a new beginning, for purpose, perhaps even for redemption. Texas was in the middle of revolution, and Crockett saw an opportunity to fight for something bigger than himself. He joined a group of volunteers heading to San Antonio and arrived at the Alamo in early 1836. It was an old Spanish mission-turned-military outpost, a crumbling fort with thick stone walls and thin hopes. Inside were fewer than 200 men. Outside, closing in, was the Mexican army, thousands strong, led by General Santa Anna, a man determined to crush the Texan rebellion once and for all. For 13 days, the defenders of the Alamo held their ground. They fought off wave after wave of assaults, knowing full well that reinforcements weren't coming. Among them, Crockett stood tall, his long rifle in hand, his humor reportedly unbroken even in the face of death. Stories would later speak of him playing his fiddle to keep morale up, telling jokes, offering encouragement. To the other men, he was more than a legend. He was a presence, a reminder that even in the shadow of defeat, courage could still burn bright. Then came March 1636. In the early hours, the final attack began. The Mexican army stormed the walls from all sides. The defenders were overwhelmed, outnumbered more than 10 to 1. It was chaos. Cannon smoke, screams, gunfire. The Alamo was falling, and the end was inevitable. What happened to Davy Crockett in those last moments is still debated. The traditional story, romanticized in paintings, books, and films, says he died fighting, surrounded by a pile of enemy soldiers he had slain before finally falling himself. It paints him as a last-stand warrior, unflinching, fearless, and unstoppable until the final breath. But other accounts, especially those recorded by Mexican officers and later witnesses, suggest a different end. According to these sources, Crockett did not die in battle. He survived. He surrendered. Along with a handful of others, he was captured after the battle ended, disarmed, and brought before Santa Anna. The decision was swift and brutal. Despite the pleas of his own officers who argued that these men deserved mercy as prisoners of war, Santa Anna ordered their execution. No trial, no hesitation. One by one they were cut down. Crockett, the man who had once stood in Congress, who had fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, who had become a living legend, was executed in cold blood. Not as a hero on the battlefield, but as a man who had laid down his arms, possibly thinking he might still live to fight again. If this version is true, and much evidence suggests it may be, it doesn't strip away his courage. It reveals something even deeper. Crockett, in surrender, likely hoped to survive, to witness another day, maybe even continue the fight. He wasn't an RV. He knew what Santa Anna was capable of. But surrender in that moment might have felt like the only choice left to a man who had seen too much death. It wasn't cowardice. It was calculation. It was survival instinct, and that makes his end even more tragic. He died not in glory, but in betrayal. By a ruthless enemy, by the myths that reshaped his story, and even by history itself, which preferred a romantic ending over a truthful one, the sanitized version. Crockett going down in a blaze of defiance makes for better storytelling. But the reality reminds us that the frontier didn't always reward bravery. Sometimes it punished it. Davy Crockett didn't get a heroic final charge. He didn't die with a rifle in his hands and fire in his eyes. He died standing, unarmed, staring into the face of merciless power. And that, in a strange and painful way, makes him more real than any of the legends ever did. The truth is harder to swallow, but it matters more, because it shows us who Crockett truly was. Not just a symbol, not just a frontier fantasy, but a man who gave everything he had, who stood by his convictions, and who walked into Texas not for riches or fame, but for the chance to live free, even if it meant dying for it. John Henry, Doc Holliday, was a paradox. A deadly gunfighter and a trained dentist, a Southern gentleman and a gambler, a consumptive patient and a fearless outlaw. His story has been told through smoke and legend, wrapped in the myth of the Old West. But beneath the surface of cinematic glory was a man chased by more than enemies. He was hunted by time itself. And in the end, it wasn't a bullet that ended him. It was something much slower, more cruel, and inescapable. Tuberculosis. He was born in Georgia to a respectable family, educated in dentistry, and full of promise. But after a diagnosis of consumption in his early 20s, a virtual death sentence in the 1800s, he was told he had less than a year to live. Most men might have withered quietly, but Holliday chose a different path. He headed west not to escape death, but to meet it on his own terms. He became a gambler, a gunman, a drifter, known for his intelligence and biting wit. He could charm a room and clear it out with equal skill. He formed a close bond with Wyatt Earp, and together they became legends of frontier justice. Their showdown at the OK Corral in Tombstone remains one of the most storied gunfights in American history. But even as the smoke cleared and bodies fell around him, Holliday knew his real enemy wasn't out there with a revolver. It was inside him, devouring him slowly. Tuberculosis had a way of reminding him who was truly in control. Doc lived in constant pain, his lungs racked by coughing fits that brought blood to his lips, his strength drained by fevers, chills, and exhaustion. Yet somehow he kept pushing forward, gambling and gunfighting, drinking hard and living harder. His presence alone was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned outlaw. He looked half dead already, pale and thin, yet there was always a fire behind his sunken eyes. That fire was rage and defiance, and the quiet belief that he wouldn't let death win easily. For all the violence that surrounded him, the truly striking part of Doc Holliday's life was his refusal to let illness define him. He was dying from the inside out, and he knew it. Every breath came with a cost. Every night, a chance he might not wake up. But instead of retreating, he chose to live faster than the sickness could take him. If he was going to die young, and he knew he would, then he'd make damn sure the world remembered his name. People feared Doc not just because of his speed with a gun, but because he had nothing to lose. He was a man with death sitting on his shoulder, whispering in his ear every second of every day. That kind of awareness changes a person. It strips away fear, pride, ego. It leaves only raw intent, and Doc's intent was simply make every moment count and go out standing tall. But that kind of life burns quickly. Over time, even the fire that kept him going began to flicker. The coughing worsened. The fits became more frequent. He began spitting blood more often than words. He moved from one dry climate to another, hoping to find air that might ease the suffering in his lungs. But it was like pouring water into a cracked glass. The relief never lasted. The end kept coming. By 1887, he was a shadow of the man who had once stood beside Wyatt Earp. Gaunt, weak, barely able to walk, Doc checked into the Hotel Glenwood in Colorado. There, in a small room surrounded by the thin walls of fading wallpaper and the scent of medicines that did nothing, he waited. He had no money left, no reputation to uphold, no enemies to outdraw. He had only death left to greet, and he did so with the same grim humor that had followed him through life. According to the nurse who was with him in his final moments, Doc looked down at his feet and let out a soft, puzzled laugh. "This is funny," he said. "I'm dying with my boots off." It was a simple line, but it said everything. He had expected, maybe even hoped, to die in a shootout, with his boots still on, gun smoking in his hand. Instead, he died quietly in a bed with nothing but the sound of his own rag breath fading into silence. There were no saloons, no bullets, no fast hands drawing steel. Just a slow, cruel ending that had stalked him from the day of his diagnosis. His life had been loud, chaotic, filled with fire and defiance. But his death was cold and alone, and maybe that's what makes his story so haunting. Doc Holliday didn't die because he wasn't fast enough or strong enough or ruthless enough. He died because no one can outrun time. His illness didn't take him in a rush. It claimed him inch by inch, day by day over years of battle. And yet he faced it with more courage than any gunfight ever required. For all the legends built around him, the most powerful truth is that Doc Holliday was human, flawed, brilliant, broken, and in the end, powerless to stop the thing he fought the hardest. Billy the Kid lived fast. He had to. In a land where trust was rare and bullets were common, speed was the only thing that kept him alive. Born Henry McCarty, though also known as William H. Bonney, he grew up in the brutal backlands of the American frontier. He was just a boy when he was forced into manhood, surviving through petty theft, quick wit, and a gun he learned to use before he finished growing. His legend didn't come from the number of years he lived. It came from the number of times he should have died and didn't. Until, one night, he did. Billy's reputation as an outlaw was as much shaped by politics as by fact. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a pawn in a larger game. During the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, a bloody conflict between rival factions over land, cattle, and influence, Billy chose a side, the Tunstall-McSween faction, mainly because they had treated him with dignity. When John Tunstall, a man who had mentored Billy, was murdered, the boy who had once stolen butter and clothes turned into a revenge-driven gunslinger. He hunted Tunstall's killers without mercy, and by the time the smoke cleared, Billy the Kid was a marked man. He was charming, fluent in Spanish, loved by Mexican communities, and admired by many for his loyalty to friends and his defiance of authority. But he was also deadly, credited with killing at least 8 men. His ability to escape capture became the stuff of frontier legend. He broke out of jails, slipped past passes, and vanished into the hills like smoke. He was fast, but more than that, he was clever. He knew how to read a room, how to manipulate a situation, how to stay just one step ahead. And then came Pat Garrett. Garrett, a former friend turned sheriff, was tasked with bringing Billy to justice. The irony was sharp. Someone who had once shared drinks and stories with Billy was now hunting him. They weren't enemies by blood, but by duty. Garrett was a man who saw the changing tides of the West. Civilization was closing in, and the era of outlaws like Billy was ending. The law needed a win. Billy was that win. Garrett captured him once, and Billy was sentenced to hang. But in true Billy the Kid fashion, he escaped, killing 2 deputies in the process. The jailbreak was daring and violent, a final act of rebellion, but it only sealed his fate. Garrett knew the escape would push public pressure even harder. The hunt resumed, but this time with greater intensity. There would be no second capture. In July 1881, Garrett got a tip. Billy was hiding near Fort Summer at the home of a friend. Garrett waited in the dark inside the house. When Billy entered, likely expecting a peaceful night, he sensed something was wrong. Legend says he whispered, "Be Quinnes." "Who is it?" As he entered the room, unaware that Garrett was just feet away. In that moment, Garrett raised his revolver and fired. The bullet struck Billy in the chest. He fell, dead before he hit the ground. There was no fight, no duel, no last words, just a gunshot in the dark. What makes Billy's death so haunting is not just the suddenness of it, but the familiarity of betrayal. Pat Garrett had once been part of Billy's world. To die not in a standoff with a known enemy, but at the hands of a man he had trusted, even liked, added a final bitter twist to a life already filled with irony. The West wasn't a place of loyalty. It was a place where alliances shifted with the wind, where survival sometimes meant turning on your past. Billy didn't die with his gun drawn. He died confused, unarmed, and unaware that his end had arrived. The young man who had dodged bullets, ducked passes, and danced between justice and crime was taken by surprise, not by the world, but by someone who had once shared it with him. The story of Billy the Kid is more than just a tale of outlaw violence. It's a story of youth lost too soon, of a life shaped by a violent world of trust misplaced. Billy was just 21 when he died. In those 2 decades, he had lived more lives than most, each one marked by a constant fight to belong, to survive, and to be understood. His death marked the end of something larger than himself. It was the closing chapter of the lawless, dusty, uncertain West. A moment where the outlaw era gave way to lawmen and fences, to order and rules. But the way he died, a bullet in the dark, fired by a friend, echoes deeper than any law book could capture, because in the end, Billy the Kid wasn't killed by justice. He was killed by familiarity. And in a land where betrayal was sometimes more dangerous than bullets, that's what truly ended the legend. Kit Carson's story is the kind that rises from dusty trails and echoes through the canyons of the American West. He was a scout, a trapper, and a soldier. More importantly, he was a man born of contradictions, both revered and reviled. Carson wasn't a man who chased fame. It found him anyway. His reputation was built not on self-promotion, but on what others whispered around campfires in the pages of dime novels. He was a living legend by the time he was 30, a frontier hero whose exploits stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the deserts of New Mexico. Born in 1809 in Kentucky, Carson left home at 16, escaping an apprenticeship to follow the Santa Fe Trail. That moment of rebellion would become the first step on a lifelong path into the wilderness. By the 1830s, he was running with the mountain men, those tough, solitary trappers who lived with one eye on the beaver and the other on hostile terrain. His small frame and quiet demeanor belied a mind built for survival. He learned multiple Native American dialects, lived among tribes, and often served as a translator between cultures that barely tolerated each other. He wasn't just surviving, he was adapting, learning the language of the land. But for all the folklore around him, Kit Carson's end wasn't a blaze of glory or a final shootout at high noon. No, his death was a slow erosion, a gradual surrender to time and regret. By the 1860s, the world Carson helped shape had begun to leave him behind. The frontier was changing. Railroads were replacing trails. The wild lands were being surveyed, fenced, and claimed. Carson, once the sharp-eyed scout guiding John C. Fremont through uncharted territory, was now a man weighed down by age and the consequences of orders carried out during his military years. One of the darkest chapters of Carson's life came during the Navajo Long Walk in 1864, when under orders from the U.S. Army, he led campaigns that resulted in the forced relocation of thousands of Navajo people. Though some argue Carson was merely a soldier following orders, others see this a defining stain on his legacy, a moment where the frontier hero became complicit in its most tragic policies. The man who once lived peacefully among native tribes had become a tool of a government bent on expansion at any cost. His physical health declined in parallel with his emotional weight. Years of hard living, trekking mountain passes, enduring gunshot wounds, sleeping under open skies through every kind of weather, had taken their toll. He had been battered by both the land and history. His body began to betray him, aneurysms, respiratory issues, and failing organs, yet he remained stoic, refusing pity. There was no dramatic farewell, no epic last stand. Instead, Carson died quietly in 1868 in Fort Lyon, Colorado, not long after the death of his beloved wife Josepha. Some say it was a broken heart that finally felled him. His final words are believed to have been, "Doctor, compadre adios." Simple, undramatic, but fitting for a man whose life was never about glory but grit. In the end, Carson's death mirrored his life. Understated, practical, and deeply rooted in the land he knew so well. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was simply a man shaped by a brutal and changing landscape, a man who did what he thought was right, even when that meant carrying out the orders that history would later judge harshly. There is something haunting about Kit Carson's final chapter, not because it was tragic in the traditional sense, but because it encapsulated the uncomfortable truth of the frontier experience. The wilderness wasn't kind. It didn't reward sentimentality. It demanded everything: your strength, your conscience, even your soul. Carson gave all three. He outlasted the wild, but not the weight of what it asked of him. His name remains etched into maps and monuments, but the man behind the myth is harder to grasp. He wasn't the caricature of Western dime novels, nor was he a heartless enforcer of U.S. policies. He was both. He was the scout who saved lives and the soldier who took them. He was the friend of tribes and the instrument of their displacement. Kit Carson was, like the frontier itself, full of contradictions, neither fully hero nor wholly villain. His story forces us to look past the legends and ask harder questions. Who do we celebrate and why? What do we choose to remember? Kit Carson didn't die on a battlefield, didn't perish in a duel, and didn't fall to some feral beast. He died as many frontiersmen did, worn out, physically diminished, and emotionally exhausted by the demands of a life spent on the edge of civilization. There were no crowds, no trumpets, no final ride into the sunset. Just silence and the lingering echo of a life that helped shape a nation, one trail at a time. Tom Horn's life was a paradox written in gunpowder and regret. Born in Missouri in 1860, he came of age at a time when the American frontier was less of a place and more of a state of mind. Wild, lawless, and unforgiving. From the very beginning, Horn seemed built for it. He was clever, spoke multiple languages including Spanish and several native dialects, and could track a man for days through mountains and dust. But above all, Horn was a marksman, deadly accurate and completely devoid of hesitation. He made his name doing what others couldn't, finding men, confronting them, and putting them in the dirt. Horn's early years with the U.S. Army as a scout and interpreter during the Apache Wars forged his lethal skill set. He moved like a shadow, learned to read the land, and struck without warning. These were talents that made him indispensable to the Pinkerton Detective Agency, until they became too dangerous even for them. Horn's willingness to kill without question and his cold, unflinching attitude toward violence made him an asset when things got dirty, but a liability when politics demanded restraint. He drifted from lawman to mercenary and eventually to what he was best at, hired gun. Cattle barons in Wyoming saw Horn as a solution to a growing problem: rustlers. The lines between justice and revenge were already blurred in the West, and Horn never cared to sort them out. He simply followed the money. He tracked down suspected rustlers and gave them warnings, cryptic notes, silent rides by their homesteads. When that didn't work, the killings began. Horn never made his murders public, but the cattlemen never asked questions. As long as their livestock stopped disappearing, they were content to look the other way. Horn's reputation grew. People feared him, respected him, or quietly hoped he'd never show up on their land. The trouble was, a reputation like that comes with a price, and eventually someone would be asked to pay it. In 1901, that someone was a 14-year-old boy named Willie Nickel, found dead near his family's homestead in Iron Mountain, Wyoming. His father, a sheepherder, had been in a bitter conflict with local cattlemen. Many believed Horn had been hired to send a message, and the message had come in the form of a bullet. There were no witnesses, no hard evidence, only a whispered legacy of violence and the chilling fact that Horn had been seen in the area. What followed wasn't justice, it was theater. Horn, drunk and boastful as ever, reportedly admitted the killing to a deputy while in custody. But the confession was shaky, possibly coerced. Still, the murder of a child couldn't go unpunished, and the community needed someone to hang for it. Tom Horn had made himself too easy a target. His trial was less about guilt and more about symbolism. The West was changing. The days of vigilante justice were closing, and Horn, with all his cold efficiency, represented a world the public was ready to bury. Despite inconsistencies and the lack of physical proof, he was convicted. People who once praised him now shook their heads and turned away. The same men who had hired him kept their distance, pretending they didn't know the ghost they once called to clean up their messes. Horn spent his final days in jail with the same quiet intensity he had carried his entire life. He never admitted guilt. Whether he had killed the boy or not, he knew the outcome had been decided long before the jury ever deliberated. He made peace with it in his own way, crafting his own coffin out of pine, as if controlling even the terms of his burial. He played the fiddle, told stories to pass time, and on November 20, 1903, walked to the gallows without flinching. As the trapdoor opened and the rope snapped taut, it wasn't just the life of one man that ended. It was the death knell of an era. Horn was the last breath of a time when survival meant doing unspeakable things and asking no questions afterward. A time when the West was not a land of heroes, but of hard choices and harder consequences. People still debate whether Tom Horn was truly guilty of that final murder. But in many ways, it doesn't matter. The blood he spilled over the years had soaked too deep into the soil of the frontier to be washed away by doubt or sympathy. The hired gun had become too dangerous, too notorious, and too symbolic of a past the West was eager to forget. His grave rests in Columbia Cemetery, Colorado, simple and weather-worn. Tourists pass by now, some leaving coins or flowers, others just reading the name and moving on. But those who truly understand the story know that Tom Horn wasn't just another outlaw. He was a man shaped by a brutal world who became its instrument, and in the end, its sacrifice. Kit Carson's name echoed across the plains, through mountain passes and deserts, a name carried on the wind like a ghost of the frontier itself. He was more than a legend. He was a scout soldier, trapper, and guide who became the embodiment of westward expansion. But behind the daring tales and wild exploits was a man whose end came not with a gunfight or ambush, but with the slow and painful disintegration of his body, worn down by decades of hard-living war and loss. The same frontier that had made him famous would ultimately be the landscape of his quiet, undramatic death. A passing that speaks volumes about the wear of time and the price of legacy. From a young age, Carson embraced the unforgiving terrain of the West. He became a trapper in his teens, abandoning formal education to learn the language of survival from the land itself. His life was spent in the company of danger, hunting grizzly bears, navigating icy rivers, outpacing hostile war parties, and living for months on end in wilderness that chewed up lesser men. As a guide for John C. Furaymont's expeditions, Carson proved indispensable in mapping the unknown and bringing the vast, uncharted regions of the West into the American consciousness. He became a figure of lore, cool under pressure, impossibly tough, and always one step ahead of death. But even legends grow old. After a life of living on the edge, the years began to catch up to Kit Carson. His body, once hardened by cold winters and long treks, began to falter. He developed an aortic aneurysm, a serious and ultimately fatal condition in the days before modern surgery or even consistent medical understanding. The very heart that had carried him through 1,000 life or death encounters was now a time bomb ticking silently within him. At the same time, Carson's personal life mirrored the exhaustion of his physical body. His beloved wife Josepha died shortly after childbirth in 1868, a blow that devastated him. She had been the center of his private world, and her loss left a void that could not be filled by medals, monuments, or presidential praise. Carson had spent decades defying the odds, surviving hostile land, hostile people, and even government bureaucracy, but grief, real unrelenting grief, was something no bulletproof persona could defend against. After Josepha's death, Carson's health declined rapidly. Friends and family described him as a man who had lost his will to fight, a warrior without a war, a mountain man without a mountain to conquer. He moved slower, spoke less, and seemed to withdraw into the shadows of his former self. He returned to Colorado, where he had once roamed freely, but this time not to lead men or explore unknown terrain. He came home to die. In May of 1868, Kit Carson passed away from complications of his aneurysm. There was no grand showdown, no final standoff with bandits or native warriors. Instead, he simply faded. His last words were, "Adios, compadres," a farewell not just to his family, but to a life of struggle, adventure, and relentless motion. He had lived through some of the most transformative years in American history and played a role in shaping them, but he died in the quiet company of loved ones, far removed from the sound of gunfire or the howl of a wolf. The contrast between Carson's mythic life and his undramatic death is striking. It reminds us that the legends of the American frontier were, in the end, human. Beneath the tales of heroism and endurance, there were fragile bodies, hearts that could break, and minds weighed down by memories of all they had seen and done. Carson, who had once walked unharmed through walls of bullets, could not escape the slow betrayal of age and sorrow. Yet, there's something hauntingly beautiful about the way he died. It was a death without spectacle, but not without meaning. Carson's life was forged in chaos, but his death offered a rare moment of stillness. In a world where so many of his peers died violently, ambushed, murdered, betrayed, Carson was given the strange gift of time. Time to reflect, to grieve, and to say goodbye. Even in death, Kit Carson's name carried weight. Newspapers reported his passing with solemn respect. Fellow soldiers, native allies, and even former enemies acknowledged the loss. But the land didn't pause. The West kept on moving, expanding, transforming. The tracks of the railroad pushed deeper into indigenous lands. Towns rose where once there had been open range, and Carson, the man who had once walked beside history as it was being written, now belonged to it. His grave lies in Taos, New Mexico, a place steeped in the same mystery and history that defined his life. Visitors come and go, reading the etched name, remembering the tales. Some speak of him as a hero, others see the darker truths in his legacy, especially his role in the displacement of native tribes. But all agree on one thing: Kit Carson helped shape the West. And the way he died, quietly, reflectively, humanly, forces us to look past the gun belts and buckskin, to remember that even the strongest men are not immortal. Carson's story doesn't end in a blaze of glory, it ends with a whisper. A goodbye. A man closing his eyes on a world that had changed because of him, even if he could never fully explain how. That's the story of his death. No myths, no embellishments. Just the truth of a man who gave everything to the frontier and in the end was claimed by it. By the time Hugh Glass entered the annals of American frontier legend, he had already suffered more than most men could imagine. Yet what made his story unforgettable wasn't just his epic crawl across hundreds of miles of wilderness after being mauled by a grizzly bear. It was what came after. Surviving that event should have been his defining moment, but fate had other plans. Born sometime in the early 1780s, likely in Pennsylvania, Glass led a life that seemed stitched together from fevered tales passed around campfires. Parrot, explorer, fur trapper, he was all of these and more. And through each chapter of his turbulent life, Glass bore the physical and emotional scars that proved he was no ordinary man. After surviving the infamous 1823 bear attack along the Grand River, where he was left for dead by his companions, Glass dragged himself over 200 miles through hostile terrain to reach Fort Kiowa. Most men would have given up. Most wouldn't have even gotten 10 feet with broken bones, rotting flesh, and no food or weapons. But Glass was driven by rage and sheer will. He wanted revenge, he wanted answers, he wanted justice. Yet when he finally caught up to the men who had abandoned him, John Fitzgerald and the young Jim Bridger, he didn't kill them. His anger had cooled on the long crawl through hell. Maybe it was wisdom, maybe exhaustion. Either way, it was a decision that would add yet another complex layer to his myth. But legends don't live forever, and neither did Hugh Glass. He didn't die dramatically in battle with a bear this time. Nor did he pass away quietly in a bed surrounded by friends and family. Instead, he met his end in 1833 on the frozen plains near the Yellowstone River. He was ambushed and killed by Arikara warriors, the same tribe that had already caused him so much grief during his earlier expeditions. There was no last stand, no poetic farewell, just cold final silence. The man who once cheated death with every sinew of his being fell to the dangers he had stared down so many times before. The Arikara, with whom Glass had a long hostile history, didn't care about his past heroics. They saw only an enemy. To them, Hugh Glass was another trapper infringing on their land, another invader trying to strip the wilderness of its wealth. When the ambush came, there was no warning, just the whistling of arrows, the crack of gunfire, and then stillness. No fanfare, no monument, just a body in the snow eventually reclaimed by the wind and the cold. His companions in that final journey were also killed, their fates just as anonymous. Glass, whose life had once demanded attention through the sheer scale of his endurance, faded into history with barely a whisper. What stings the most about Glass's death is the irony. He had defied the odds so many times that it almost felt like he had become immune to fate. He survived pirates, native war parties, starvation, infection, and betrayal. He crawled across a wilderness most people wouldn't survive standing up. And yet death came for him in a moment of silence without drama. Perhaps that's the nature of the frontier. It gives nothing freely and takes everything without warning. Even the strongest men, the most storied legends, are ultimately just men, flesh and blood, vulnerable to the same sudden cruelty as anyone else. Glass's story wasn't widely known during his lifetime. It would take decades for his tale to be revived and romanticized. It wasn't until the late 19th and 20th centuries that newspapers, books, and eventually Hollywood gave him a second life. In these retellings, the harsh truths of his final days were often softened or omitted entirely. Some even imagined him dying peacefully, perhaps finally earning a restful end. But the reality was much harsher. He died alone in the snow, another casualty in a land that devoured men without remorse. His bones were likely never recovered. There was no gravestone to mark the spot, just fading footsteps in frozen ground, and stories that would grow long after his body had vanished. Yet, for all the myth-making, it's the real story of Hugh Glass that speaks loudest. He wasn't immortal. He wasn't invincible. He was a man who kept going when no one else would, and when he finally fell, it was not with spectacle but with silence. That is the essence of the frontier, the battle between man and nature, between grit and inevitability. Glass didn't win in the end, but for a time he held the wilderness at bay with nothing but rage, resilience, and an iron will. That legacy, no matter how he died, remains unforgettable. In the final years of the American frontier, when the dust had settled and the roaring chaos of gunfire began to fade into legend, one man's quiet death stood in stark contrast to the violence that had once defined his life. His name was Jim Baker, a man whose presence on the frontier had spanned decades, and whose story, unlike those of his fellow legends, ended not in bloodshed or betrayal, but in the slow, relentless passage of time. Baker had been there from the beginning, One of the original mountain men who dared to venture west into uncharted territory when maps were merely guesses and every river crossing could be your last. He trapped beaver in the high Rockies when the fur trade was booming, trading with the Crow and Shoshone, and surviving winters so brutal they'd make most men break. He wasn't flashy like Kit Carson, nor violent like Wild Bill Hickok, but he was reliable, enduring, and respected by those who knew what true survival meant. His legacy was quiet, forged not in a single act of heroism, but in thousands of days lived close to death and further from civilization. By the time he settled down near Denver in the 1870s, the world around him had changed. Railroads had cut across lands he once crossed on horseback. Soldiers patrolled areas he had once scouted alone. Trading posts had become towns, and towns had become cities. The wildness he once thrived in was being tamed, and with it, men like Baker became relics. They were still respected, still consulted when a young deputy wanted to know how to track a horse thief or read a broken trail. But their days were ending. Baker adapted. He built a home, raised a family, and lived to see grandsons who knew nothing of buffalo herds that shook the ground or of war parties that hunted under the cover of night. He didn't seek fame, and he never wrote a memoir. When reporters came to interview him in his old age, he shared stories reluctantly, always careful to emphasize the land, not the man. He believed the land shaped you more than anything else, and maybe that's why it eventually wore him down. Not all at once, but in pieces day by day. He spent his last years on a modest ranch near Savory, Wyoming. The place had wide skies and long winters, just the kind he liked. There he'd sit on his porch, pipe in hand, eyes scanning the horizon like he always had. Only this time, not for danger but for memory. His hearing faded, and his sight dimmed, but his mind stayed sharp. He remembered the old days, the frozen streams, the ambushes, the long rides alone. And he remembered the men who hadn't made it, those who blot out in the snow or disappeared into the wilderness without a trace. Sometimes he spoke their names aloud, as if saying them kept them alive just a little longer. In 1898, when Jim Baker finally passed, there were no bullets or arrows, no ambushes or betrayals. He died quietly in his sleep, an old man wrapped in a wool blanket, in a wooden house that smelled of smoke and leather. The newspapers wrote a few lines, calling him a pioneer and the last of his kind. But they didn't really understand what he had lived through. No obituary could capture the loneliness of sleeping in a snow cave at 12,000 feet, or the joy of finding a small stream full of trout after 3 days without food. They couldn't understand what it meant to be part of a land that had tried to kill you and yet shaped you into someone unbreakable. Baker's death was not tragic in the traditional sense. He wasn't cut down in his prime or betrayed by a friend. His tragedy was subtler. He had outlived the world he was built for. The frontier he had once conquered now existed only in history books and ghost stories told around campfires. He became a man out of place and out of time, his skills no longer needed, his memories fading like the last stars before dawn. And yet there's something deeply powerful in that kind of ending. Not every legend ends in a blaze of glory. Some simply endure until there's nothing left to endure. Jim Baker was the embodiment of that endurance. He stood as a bridge between eras, between the raw savagery of early exploration and the structured expansion of modern America. He reminded the world, simply by surviving, that the frontier was not just a place but a state of mind, a constant battle against the elements, against fear, and against giving up. So when he died, it wasn't just the end of a man, it was the quiet closing of a chapter in American history, one without fireworks or morning bands, but with a dignity born of perseverance. The death of Jim Baker was not loud or cinematic, it was a whisper. And yet, in that whisper was the voice of the entire American frontier, fading, but never quite silent. They didn't die in glory, wrapped in flags or praised by history books. They died in canyons, saloons, mountain passes, and lonely cabins. Some fell to bullets, others to time, but they lived by their own code, raw, unforgiving, and unbreakable. These men weren't chasing fame. They weren't building legacies. They were surviving, fighting, exploring, and carving out a brutal existence on a land that didn't care who you were. Their stories weren't passed down with reverence. They were whispered, half-believed, half-forgotten. Yet behind every myth was a man, flesh, bone, grit. A man who stood alone when no one else would. A man who looked death in the eye more than once and still pushed forward. And in the end, when their time came, they didn't run. They faced it like they faced everything else, head on. So the next time you hear a name like Boone, Crockett, or Hickok, remember these weren't just legends. They were real men. And they paid the full price for shaping the West. Their glory wasn't in how they lived, but in how fiercely they refused to back down, even as the final chapter closed. And that, perhaps, is the truest mark of a legend.